Shall we start?
Shira, let's start, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted.
Oh,
yeah. Let's start.
Okay. So hello. It's nice to see everyone. Is there someone new who has joined? Yes? No? Okay. Naomi had mentioned that there was someone who.
Yeah, there was someone, Ayelet. I don't know if she's coming on or when she's coming on. She had her first shift today coming back from maternity leave, so she might be running a few minutes late.
It says Ayelet's on.
Oh, yeah, it's here? Oh, okay. That was Kat's?
Yeah, I'm on. Sorry.
Oh,
Just
hi.
now it's my thing, but I was on the sheer last week also. I just didn't introduce myself. Sorry.
Hello. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
So I hope everyone is well. Last week we talked a bit about how halacha tries to balance, how much emphasis halacha places on maximizing the time that a woman is permitted to her husband. And we talked about different ways to become a nida, and how we exit, and how we reach tahara, and the process, and some common mistakes that we make along the way. And this week we thought we had spoken last week that we would talk about birth control and how it affects nida and issues related to nida. And I know that Shira polled people to get a sense of what they would like to hear about. So we're going to try to make tonight cater to everyone tonight. So when we talk about birth control, usually you go to the doctor and you kind of have to know what you want to ask for. It's unlikely the doctor will take the time to sit with you and go through the different options and consider the implications of each option in terms of becoming nida and how it might affect your life and how halacha might approach it. So tonight I'd like to take the time to talk about what options are available, to think about how they can impact upon your relationship and your life and affect you, and how they affect you in terms of nida and taharat mishpacha, and also how what the different benefits and risks are medically. So let's start with the medical issues. And I made I did things in PowerPoint this week because I wanted to show pictures that, I wanted to show pictures that captured it better than you could see just on a handout. And so I'm going to share screen with you, with your permission. Okay. So hold on. Okay. So when we talk about, the first issue to think about when we talk about birth control, well, there's several, but let's begin with the medicine. So what is an effective birth control? And that question is really important. This is from the CDC, and it affects how to prioritize the different birth control options, in the sense of, if you're in a situation for one reason or another where you absolutely cannot get pregnant, whether it's for medical reason or otherwise, then you need to think about birth controls that will give you as close to 100% as possible. This number for a diaphragm is actually significantly higher if used with spermicide. So it reaches, the highest levels up here. But depending on your situation, you may or may not have more wiggle room with, the possibility of becoming pregnant. There's also the safety issue. When we talk about birth control, we can divide it up into non-hormonal birth control and hormonal birth control. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the safety of hormonal birth control. So for example, for many years, we've known that hormonal birth control can increase the risk of breast cancer. Now, I have to raise this topic because I'm an oncologist who has spent most of her life dedicated to treating breast cancer. And so recently, there has been data that's come out that suggests that actually, well, we suspected that maybe the old birth control had a lot more higher doses of hormones in it, and maybe the current ones would not increase the risk of breast cancer. And we now know that all hormonal birth control, whether it's in the form of birth control pills or in the form of the Mirena, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which uses progesterone in the IUD, that all birth control that has hormones in it slightly increases the risk of breast cancer. And when I say slightly, I will give you an exact number. If you take 100,000 women who use hormonal birth control of one form or another for a year, 13 will develop breast cancers that could be attributed to the hormonal therapy. 13 extra breast cancers out of 100,000. Now, how does that compare to other risk factors? So you may not even think about it, but 3 to 6 glasses of wine or alcohol a week can increase the risk of breast cancer by 200. So if you take 100,000 women who drink 3 to 6 glasses of wine per week, there will be 265 extra cases of breast cancer per year. Compare the 13 extra cases from hormonal birth control to the 265 from alcohol, and it seems to be, it depends on how you look at that number. To me, that looks like a very small number, but again, everyone needs to put it in perspective. The risks might be a little bit higher in women who are over 40 or have a family history. And the risks go back to zero after you stop immediately if you've only used for a short time, and it can take a few years for it to go back to normal if you use for longer. And there's so many ways that we can reduce our risk of breast cancer in our daily lives that we don't even think about. We just focus on things, we focus on hormones, we focus on medicines, we focus on radiation from the insulation in our house, which is not a proven risk for breast cancer, but we focus on all of these things, and yet there are many ways that we can significantly reduce our chances of developing breast cancer by exercising regularly, by maintaining a healthy weight. And so I just want to put the breast cancer issue in perspective, because that is also a factor that we consider when we talk about the medical issues surrounding birth control. And then, of course, there's how birth control will affect your life, and what works for you and what issues are more complicated for you. So there's your issue of your own personal health and your own health concerns. And for example, is there a risk of breast cancer in the family? And how important is it from a medical perspective that you not become pregnant? There are emotional considerations, because some of the hormonal birth controls may impact your mood. There is the issue of sex drive. So some of the hormonal birth controls you might have heard about it, can affect your desire for intimacy. How common is that? Only about 5% of women who use hormonal birth control experience it. And who's more likely to experience it? Well, if you tend to have fluctuations in your desire on just in a normal month when you're not using birth control, you might be more prone to it. There's also some thinking that maybe taking progesterone alone, either in the form of Mirena or Cerazette, may affect it less. And certainly the Mirena, which has a lower dose of progesterone, may be less inclined to lead to this problem. There's the question of what kind of birth control works works for you? Can you work with something that you need to use every time before you have intercourse? Do you need a birth control that you don't need to think about, that you could go 5 years without thinking about? Or are you able to take something every day? And then there's the issue of spotting. Can you manage, can you navigate the possibility of having spotting and the halachic implications of that? And what about lengthening your cycle? Would it be helpful to you to have longer intervals between periods? For some women, that's really important. For other women, less so. And then there's the issue of chatzitza, using a birth control that you might need to remove when you go to the mikvah. And so these are some of the various different factors that go into play in the conversation of what birth control to think about. And then, of course, there are the halachic issues. So the first halachic issue is, can one use birth control after fulfilling the mitzvah of Pruruvu? And that is a topic for a shir in and of itself. And I encourage everyone to speak to someone, a posik that they're comfortable addressing that issue. In a nutshell, the mitzvah of Pruruvu is from the Torah. It's biblical. It falls upon the man, and at least according to how we paskin. And it involves having a boy and a girl. And then there's a separate mitzvah. And that separate mitzvah is Erev lo Tanach al Tanach Yadecha, that one should always be engaged in the mitzvah Pruruvu, even once that mitzvah has been fulfilled. It falls upon the man. It's d'Rabbanan, and it's rabbinic, and it is fulfilled by having another child after fulfilling the mitzvah Pruruvu. So either a son or a daughter. And then we get to the third mitzvah, was lo tohu bara lashevet yitzra, that the world was not created to sit empty. This is a rabbinic commandment, and it falls upon the woman to fill the world, to populate the world. And it's fulfilled by having a son or a daughter or two children of the same gender. And so some of the issues that, and so there is no right answer for how many children am I supposed to have. It's a very personal decision. And what one family can handle, another family might not be able to handle. And so one balances between the desire to fill the world and to have children with realities of health, realities of income, how much patience do we have? How much energy do we have to raise our children, to lechanech them, to educate them, and especially if we have children with special needs. How does halacha prioritize birth control? What's the number one first choice birth control in halacha? I should just take a step back, that what works for birth control that may work for many, many years can and seem perfect can suddenly become problematic. And when that happens, it's important to turn to your doctor. It's important to also turn to a halachic authority who can guide you through this. And it's important to know when maybe it's time to switch. So what are some of the halachic considerations? If you go to a posek and you say, tell me what's the number one choice, you can go to 10 poskim and you could get different answers. And in fact, when we get to the diaphragm, we'll talk about exactly how poskim can look at the same halachic issue and come to very different conclusions. So the issues that one must balance when talking about the halachic prioritization of birth control include, does the birth control cause ktamim? Does it cause staining? Do we think that there's a possibility that it causes the wasting of seed, shfichat zera levatala? Does it allow for tashmish kederech kol haaretz? Does it allow for intercourse to be performed in its natural way? How does it affect health, a woman's health? Does it reduce the number of days of nida? And how easy is it to use? And so that brings us to our first case. Last week we learned by sharing with you some of the stories of women who I've had the the zchut to help. And I'd like to share some stories, some examples of women who've come to me with birth control issues to review, to talk about what each kind of birth control involves and some of the halachic issues that might arise and some of the considerations. So I'd like to start with Leora. Leora has just had a miscarriage, and she had a DNC, and the doctor has told her that she can't get pregnant this month. She has to wait 1 month to have a normal cycle, and then she can try to get pregnant. But tonight is mikveh night, and she asked him what she should use for birth control, and the doctor told her to use a condom. Now she calls me up and she says, what am I supposed to do? Can I use a condom? So the answer is that the condom is probably the least halachically desirable form of birth control for 2 reasons. Because it does not allow the zera to enter the woman's body, and so it's considered shfichat zera levatala, wasting of seed, and also the man uses it. And because the mitzvah pruruv falls upon the man, forms of birth control that affect the man, that the man uses, are halachically problematic. However, mitzvah onah is a critical issue. It's a biblical mitzvah. We talked about it a little bit last week, and how when a posek is always balancing between mitzvah onah and hilchot nida, and we know how important mitzvah onah is. It's in last week's parsha, she'ara uksuta va'onata lo yigra. And so if there is absolutely no other way that the couple can have relations, and it's medically dangerous to do otherwise, then one can turn to a posek and ask, may we use a condom, and see what the answer is. Certainly in a case where the husband has HIV, or there's concern that one party has HIV, there's a pending HIV test, or the husband has CMV and the wife is pregnant. These are situations where there really isn't another safe option for them to have intercourse. And so the halachic question is a very powerful one. However, if there is another halachic option, then that is the preferred approach. And so for our woman, the options for her, well, hormonal treatment is not an option because it can take many months for a woman to get through bleeding with a hormonal birth control, and she wants to get pregnant. So hormonal birth control could interfere with her balance of hormones. A diaphragm is an option, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but it requires a doctor's prescription. It requires fitting. It's not so easy to find someone who can do that in Israel. And she isn't in the doctor's office anymore. She's going to the mikveh tonight. Spermicides are an option. And they contain inoxanol 9, which is a chemical that kills the sperm. And they come in the form of foams and films, contraceptive inserts, tablets, suppositories. There's a sponge that you can place up against your cervix that contains the spermicide. There are also creams and gels. There's spermicidal jelly that can be used with a diaphragm that increases the efficacy of the diaphragm. Now, from the previous slide, you can see that the spermicide is not the most effective form of contraception. And so it's recommended that that when you're using it, you follow the instructions very, very carefully. And it needs to be inserted 10 to 15 minutes before having intercourse, and not more than 30 to 60 minutes afterwards to maximize its efficacy.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
For a woman in this situation, I was in this situation just like after having a C-section, and I wasn't on birth control at the time, and the doctor suggested like a certain amount of time, I forgot, it was with my first, before getting pregnant again. So I needed kind of like a short-term, long-term solution. Is there anything that doesn't have to be like applied the minute of? Because I found that method to be really disturbing.
Yes.
It
So,
seems like all of these.
right.
like-
So these are the non-hormonal options. And so hormones are an option, but the problem is that there can be, and you could do that if you need it. The doctor said 6 months. You could take the pill for 6 months, and hopefully not have too much staining. That's the concern with going the hormonal route. But all of these other, and again, as I said, the idea of using something right beforehand maybe is a deterrent, and that's a factor to take into consideration when choosing a form of birth control. But the only other option is a hormonal one. And we'll talk about the hormonal options. There are hormonal options that don't require everyday interventions. You don't have to think about, for 3 weeks on end. So we'll talk about that. But it's definitely a deterrent to have to think about using something beforehand, and it makes it much less attractive. From a halachic perspective, the spermicides are not considered shfichat zera levatala, even though they inactivate the sperm, because the zera is able to enter the rechem. It's able to enter into the uterus. The sponge is a little bit more problematic halachically, a little bit less desirable, because you might feel it while having relations. Now, I want to share with you a new product. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's called Phexxi. Has anyone heard of it? Okay, so I'm very excited to talk about this, because a gynecologist called me in the middle of Shir on Sunday to ask me if it is halachically permissible. And it is a new product just approved by the FDA on December 20th in the United States, not yet here in Israel. It is a prescription non-hormonal birth control. And what it is it's not a spermicide. So a spermicide, what I showed you before, has nonoxynol 9, which can cause urinary tract infections. It can cause burning. This Phexxi contains natural products like lactic acid, and it is present in this applicator. You insert it like a tampon, again, unfortunately, prior to having intercourse, half hour up to an hour beforehand. And what it does is it adjusts the pH of the vagina so that the sperm can't survive in that pH. It makes it acidic, and they need a less acidic environment. And what's nice about, one of the advantages of this is that it may be less likely to cause urinary tract infection, it may be less likely to burn. It halachically is acceptable because it's not killing the sperm, which even the spermicide is permitted, and it allows the sperm to enter into the rechem. And it is more effective than the spermicide. So the spermicide is 79% effective. This Phexxi is 86% effective, and that's for everyone. That includes women who forgot to use it, and it includes women who put it in at the wrong time. And if you look at just the women who used it properly, it's 93% effective. So this is something that is also an option. It may be more comfortable for women. It's not yet here in Israel, but it's something worth thinking about in the future. So now let's now move on to the diaphragm. Leah calls me up that she was using her diaphragm, and she took it out and she found blood on the diaphragm. Is she a nida? So the diaphragm is a latex cap that covers the cervix, and to be more effective, it can be used with spermicide inside. It must be inserted prior to intercourse, and you must keep it in for 6 hours after intercourse. Any amount of blood, any blood inside afterwards that is of a halachically not acceptable color. So red or black, we talked about the colors last week, or a dark brown would be halachically problematic, because we have to be concerned, as we spoke last week, whenever we see blood, when there is a possibility that there was hargasha that was masked by intense genital activity, we have to, the woman is potentially a nida. We have to worry that there is hargasha, either accompanied or masked by the intercourse or the insertion or removal of the diaphragm. And so even a drop of blood in one of these problematic colors would render her a nida. And so in the absence of any other explanation, she is a nida. And last week, Atara asked about a bodeket. She raised the issue of going to a bodeket Tara and when to think about sending someone to a bodeket. And so just to develop that point, someone who sees a ketem during Shiva Nikiyim, someone who can't get a clean hefsek, or someone who sees blood after having relations, where we have to worry that perhaps relations triggered nida. That's a special halachic status. And so in the absence of any other medical findings, this woman is a nida. So I sent her to a bodeket who, because the blood in the diaphragm was red, sent her to a bodeket who actually saw a cut in the cervix. Now, maybe it was from placing the diaphragm, maybe it was from intercourse, maybe it was from removing the diaphragm when she scratched herself. And so she is not a nida. And I instructed her moving forward, when she takes out her diaphragm, to just clean it, not to look at it, because any amount of blood on that diaphragm would put her into this very difficult situation. And so that has been what she does moving forward. And so those are the non-hormonal interventions. There's also a type of IUD that's copper that we will talk about a little bit later, but those are pretty much the options for non-hormonal birth control. When it comes to hormonal birth control, there are several options. There is a patch that we'll talk about. There are pills that one can take, either progesterone alone or in combination, estrogen and progesterone. There is a NuvaRing, which is has the same hormones as a birth control pill, but in the form of a ring that resides in the cervix. And then there is Depo-Provera, which is an injection of progesterone that one can receive that prevents ovulation for 3 months. Now, in the beginning, when one takes any of these, uses any of these hormonal forms of birth control, there is a possibility of bleeding as the body adjusts to it. And how frequent is that? Because this has major implications for NIDA. So estrogen, progesterone together, 10 to 30%. Progesterone only, oral contraception, 40 to 70%, quite high. The patch, I don't have an exact number, but discussions with my gynecology colleagues have said that it's definitely lower than with the oral forms because it gives a constant dose of hormones and there's no room to forget. Part of the problem, sometimes what gets people into trouble with birth control pills is forgetting to take at the right time. The NuvaRing has about 6% bleeding at the beginning, so quite low. And it's always possible, to use any of these forms of birth control for a very long time, to be doing fine, and suddenly start to have bleeding with it, even after prolonged use. So let's take a moment to talk about, I'd like to tell you the story of Ayelet. Ayelet is, I don't need to share screen for this. Ayelet is postpartum. She'd had a baby 9 weeks ago, and she she really had a tough time getting to the mikveh, but her bdikot have all been good. And it's the 7th day, and she does her bdika on the 7th day, and it comes out bloody. So again, back to Atara's point with the bodeket, I send her to the bodeket because unless there's something there, this is the bdika is really not acceptable. It's bright red. And unless maybe there's a stitch, there's a cut there, she pulled a stitch out. Otherwise, she has to start all over again. And so the Bodeket says she sees nothing. And it takes Ayelet a few weeks to get a good hefsek Tara and to get to the mikveh. Now, what happened? She went to the gynecologist and she started Cerazet a week before when she started to count her Shiva Nakim. And she started to bleed because Cerazet causes bleeding initially. It's quite common. And so how could she have avoided this problem? I'm not sure if any of you have encountered this, but there are gynecologists who will tell women who observe Taharat Mishpacha and are postpartum going to start Cerazet to do a blood test on mikveh day. And if the hormones, estrogen and progesterone, FSH, LH are low, to go to the mikveh and to wait to start the Cerazet until a week later. That way she is tahora. And if she does have staining on the Cerazet, she can treat it as tamim as long as there isn't a flow and there isn't a hargasha, and it's much easier to deal with. But there's a chance that she could get pregnant. She's gone to the mikveh, she's gone a whole week, she's had relations. And so, yes, that risk is quite low. If someone who's nursing, who's in the first 6 months after giving birth, the risk of becoming pregnant is about 2%. So the risk is not zero. And so it's a very difficult balance between trying to prevent pregnancy with trying to get to the mikveh and manage the Cerazet. And so that is a shikul, that is a balance that one needs to make in this overall process.
Can I ask a question? Why
yes.
doesn't she start taking the pill earlier? Because if she's going to have breakthrough bleeding earlier, it wouldn't matter if she's not getting to the mikveh at week 3 anyway, or whatever.
So she could start Cerazet from after she gives birth. If she were taking a combination oral contraception of estrogen and progesterone, first of all, it's not the reason Cerazet is recommended for nursing mothers is because estrogen is a problem because it decreases the milk supply. Estrogen, you cannot start, oral contraceptives that involve estrogen can't be started immediately after delivery, or at least the gynecologists I work with are reluctant because they're worried about the risk of blood clots, and they want the risk of blood clots from pregnancy to go down before they add in the oral contraceptive that can slightly increase the risk of blood clots. She could have started the Cerazet right after giving birth and potentially been in nida the whole time that she was at risk for the bleeding. She didn't know that. She went to the doctor and she didn't want to start it at 3 weeks because what if I get to the mikveh at 4 weeks? I don't want to be in the heart of it. It's a really tough situation to be in. But that is one way of dealing with it, to say, you know what, I'll start at the day I give birth and then I won't know. But it is medically, it's fine. It would be fine to start it then. There's no medical reason to delay the Cerazet. So yes, very good point. Anyway, so what happens to her? She eventually does get to the mikveh, and then she calls me about 6 months later that she's having a lot of staining and she just doesn't know if she's a nida or if she's not a nida, and what should she do? So I ask her, are you having a flow? No. Have you had a hargasha with the bleeding? No. Have you had stains that are on an object that is makabel tuma, or that is white, that is larger than 19 millimeters, that's larger than a gris. We've talked about all these principles last week, just for review. No, no, no. So technically, you're not a nida. But then we review together what to do, how to proceed. And again, I'm just going to refresh what we talked about last week. Whoops. Hold on. Okay. Sharing screen. Let's just talk about what we reviewed last week in terms of how to proceed under the situation where she's seeing blood, and she doesn't have hargasha, and it's not a flow, and it's not immediately after genital stimulation, like urinating or having relations or a bdika. So again, I instructed her to wear colored underwear and a panty liner, to wait to wipe, and to avoid unnecessary bdikot, and inserting a tampon unless she knows she's a nida, in terms of having relations, to wait 24 hours, although technically she's not a nida, so to avoid the problem of roa machmat tashmish, the possibility that intercourse triggers nida, triggers bleeding. And if she does have intercourse, colored sheets, to wait to look, and for her husband not to look, because any amount of blood on him would would render her a nida. And so she goes ahead with this. Things are okay, and she calls me again. The staining is persisting. I say, well, perhaps, are you being careful with the time that you take the Cerazette? Because we know that that Cerazette is that the body is very sensitive when taking Cerazette, and the dose, if the level of progesterone changes ever so slightly, it can lead to bleeding. And so being off by 15 minutes is enough to cause spotting, and she hasn't been so careful. So we decide she should set an alarm on her phone. Then she says she's traveling. She's flying from Israel to the United States. She takes Cerazette every day at 10 p.m. Israel time. What should she do? Again, traveling is really hard to stick to those times. So she needs to put an alarm on her phone for 3 p.m. American time, which corresponds to 10 p.m. Israel time, to make sure to take it on time. But then she comes back from her trip, and it's really hard to stick with these times. And she wonders, could she take Depo-Provera? That's the progesterone shot that that I had shown you a picture of. And it prevents ovulation for 3 months. And it can be used during nursing because it doesn't affect the milk supply. And so the answer is that it's halachically an undesirable choice, because if she has spotting with it, it's a 3-month birth control, and she can't stop. She can't move to a different birth control. If it's not working out for her, she's stuck for the next 3 months. And so she decides that the Cerazette's not working out, and goes to her doctor to talk about maybe adding another progesterone to what she's taking, or switching to a different birth control, or perhaps thinking about a different birth control entirely. Now I'd like to tell you about Yael. So Yael has started, she just started taking a combined oral contraceptive, estrogen and progesterone, and she wants to know how to deal with onat prisha, and how to worry about how to deal with the time of anticipatory separation, when a husband and wife are not permitted to have relations, and she needs to do a bdika. So the first question is, how do we approach someone once she begins taking the pill? And this is a machloket. There's disagreement over whether someone who starts the pill is immediately considered misulaket damim, a woman who would not be expected to see blood and does not need to worry about onat prisha, or do we only give her that status after 3 months have passed? So arguing in favor of waiting 3 months is the fact that we don't know how she's going to react. Maybe she will bleed. Arguing against that in favor of saying she's mesuleket damim and not expected to bleed immediately is the fact that we have data from millions and millions of women, and we know that when they take the pill, they're not likely to get their periods. And so at Nishmat teaching is she's considered mesuleket damim immediately. What does she do when she finishes the pack? So she's taking a pack. Packs come in different formulations, as you know. There's some that are 21 days of active pills, and then 7 days of inactive, some that are 24 days of active and 4 days of inactive. What should she do? So in terms of when she stops the active and then moves over to the inactive in terms of onat prisha. So the first month, I tell her that she should follow the instructions on the packet. And if the packet says women who take this oral contraception should expect to see blood 48 hours after discontinuing their active pills. So her time of separation starts at 48 hours until she bleeds. And what happens if she doesn't bleed? So if the packet says that the bleeding, women are expected to bleed from 48 hours until a week, after a week's time, if she does a bdika and there's no blood, then she moves on and she's not in nida. There's some women who I know women who've taken Zuili who will stop the active and have no bleeding at all. If they do that for 3 months and they've done a bdika and there's nothing there, then you can ask a halachic question whether in fact you need to worry about onat prisha moving on in the future, or whether you've proven that you're a woman who is not going to bleed when she stops taking the active pill. So that's what she does the first month. The packet says 48 hours. She separates at 48 hours and happens to not bleed until 72 hours. So the next month, her onat prisha becomes 72 hours from when she finishes the active. And then the month after that, it's based on the interval from the previous month. If she goes 3 months in a row where the interval is 72 hours, she's established a veset kavua leglulot, a fixed period for birth control pills, where her period of separation is 72 hours. And when she finishes taking the pill, when does she go back to resuming vestot and onat prisha the way she used to, back to a veset kavua, a fixed period if she had one before, or worrying about the month and the interval and the 30th day, chodesh, haflaga, or onat benonit if she had a non-fixed interval? She waits until she has the first bleed on its own. And after that, the next month, if she had a vesa kavua, she goes back to worrying for that. And if she had a non-fixed period, that first month she has a normal bleed, she worries about, she separates during the chodesh and the 30th day. And then the second month, when there's already an interval, she worries about interval, month, and 30th day. Very confusing, a topic for a shir in of itself. So that's what I tell her. And the first month, she is doing okay, and she decides that she's going to double up the pack. That she heard that you can go from one pack to another, and that and not become nida. Is that halachically permissible? So we had spoken about that last week, that there is no mitzvah to become a nida, that once one becomes a nida, one must separate, and it's a mitzvah to go through all the steps of tahara, but to become a nida is not a mitzvah. And so yes, it's halachically permissible to go from one pack to another. Then she calls me, she's into the second pack, and she had relations, and there is blood on a towel. What should she do? So the question is, how long after she had relations, did she wipe herself with the towel? And why is that important? So we had spoken last week about hargasha and the possibility that under certain circumstances, there was hargasha that was masked by intense genital activity. And so if she waited more than 15 seconds, then we can treat the blood on the towel as a stain with all of the laws that we spoke about last week. If the stain is if the stain is larger than 19 millimeters on an object that is makabel tuma, that receives ritual impurity, that is white, and it can't be attributed to any other cause, then she would be considered a nida. But in the absence of that, she would not be considered nida. So it happened to be, she was after 15 seconds on a colored towel, she is not a nida. But if it were less than 15 seconds, then we have a halachically problematic situation. And then I would send her to the bodeket that we spoke about to see if there was a cut that we could attribute the bleeding to. If there is a cut, then she's not a nida. If there isn't a cut, she's a nida. And we have to worry about the possibility that perhaps relations triggered nida. And so the next time she and her husband have relations, she would need to do a bdika beforehand, and both would need to check themselves afterwards to confirm that that was not the case. And so luckily, she had waited. She knew to wait, and she was okay. That brings us to Amira. Amira has just heard about the Nuva ring. And let me just show you again a picture of the Nuva ring. Let's go back to share screen. Oops. So the Nuva ring is a silicone ring that contains estrogen and progesterone that's inserted into the cervix and remains there for 3 weeks, at which time it's removed for a week and the woman bleeds. Or you can double pack and put another one in after 3 weeks and keep going until there's staining. Now, what are some of the benefits of the Nuva ring? Well, first of all, the amount of estrogen in the Nuva ring is less than the amount in combined oral contraceptive pills. The combined pill, the lowest dose has about 20 micrograms of estrogen. The Nuva ring has 15. Also, it releases estrogen at a constant dose, which in theory should lead to less staining because there are no hormonal fluctuations. And you don't need to remember to put it in. It's there. So you don't need to take it every day. You don't need to worry about the time you're taking it. And also, you're not swallowing it. It enters your body. It's absorbed into the bloodstream from the cervix. And so if a woman is taking birth control pills and has vomiting and diarrhea, you have to worry that sometimes you might have to worry about the amount of absorption of the birth control pills. That's not the case with the Nuva ring. So she wants to know what needs to be done for bdikot. First, she wants to know how to handle it in terms of onot and how does she manage bdikot. So in terms of onat prisha, there's a disagreement over how to handle the Nuva ring. One school of thought is to just ignore it and keep going with your yom, your haflaga, and your onah benonit, your day, your interval, and your 30th day. The other school of thought is to follow the packet. If it says that you might expect bleeding 36 hours after removal, then that becomes your onat prisha. And the third school of thought is to ignore it and do your own and keep the month, the interval, and onah benonit until you develop a chazaka, until you go 3 months of having the same interval. So do onat benonit, haflaga, and chodesh until you go 3 months where you have a 72-hour interval, and that becomes your onah. That becomes your onat prisha. And that is the preference, that's the recommendation at Pua, or not Pua, at Nishmat. And that's what I tell her. In terms of b'dikot, lichatchila, the nuva ring needs to come out for hefsek tara, and you can put it back in after you do your moch dachuk. It can come out for up to 3 hours as long as it's kept in a dry, non-humid, reasonable temperature area, and it shouldn't affect the efficacy. It should also lechatchila come out for the bdika on day 1 and on day 7. However, if you forget and it's close to shkia and to go take it out and do another bdika, it's already going to be too late, or you're worried that removing it might cause bleeding, then you can rely on the opinions that say that you can do bdika with it in place, that it moves around enough, and do the bdikot without removing it. What about when she goes to the mikveh? Does she need to take it out? So the answer is yes, and that's what I tell her. But then she calls me up and she says, actually, I forgot. I'm still at the mikveh. I forgot to take it out. Do I need to retovel? And so the answer is, it depends on who you ask. Machon Pua says, yes, she needs to retovel, not with a bracha. And Nishmat, yes, they say she needs to retova without a bracha, and Nishmat says she does not need to retova. And so the women who've asked me, that has been my answer to them. And why does she not need to retova? Because it is number one, it is not hudak, it is not fixed in its place, and water could pass through, and also because it's considered makom balua. It's in a deep internal area, and while we say that internal areas, Beit HaStarim, hidden places, must have the ability to receive water when we immerse, this is so deep in potentially that it does not even need to have the potential for water to reach it. And so there are opinions that would say she does not need to reimmerse. What about Ivera? So Ivera is the patch, and it is an estrogen progesterone patch. And Avital calls me and tells me that she's using the patch, and she wants to know what to do when she goes to the mikveh Friday night. Can she reapply it? Does she need to remove it when she tovels? First of all, just for you to know, the Ivera has the same halachic debate regarding onat prisha, the time of separation, that we have for the nuva ring, and the 3 different opinions, with the Nishmat opinion to wait until you've established an interval, a fixed interval 3 times in a row, for that to be your interval for onat prisha for the Ivera. Until then, you go ahead with Chodesh, Haflaga, and Ona Benonit. So what's the story? Can she take this? What does she do with it on Friday night? Can she reapply it after she's taken it off? And what does she reapply? Does she reapply the one she had on before? Does she put a new one back on? So she can reapply it because it's like a Band-Aid and it is temporary. She does need to take it off to Tovel. If she forgets to Tovel with it, we'll get to that. If she forgets to take it off when she tovels, according to Nishmat, she needs to retovel with a bracha, and according to Machom Pua, she needs to retovel without a bracha. That's when she's in the mikveh. In terms of in terms of what to put back on, so she changes it every Sunday, and she's taking it off on Friday to Tovel. Does she put the old one back on, or does she put a new one back on? So I've had discussions with gynecologists who have told me that ideally when she takes it off before Shabbat, right before she Tovels, she should put the original sticker that it was attached to back on, Tovel, dry the area off, and then put the original one back on. If it won't go back on, she can put a new one on and keep it on until Sunday night, which is switch day, and then switch to to a new one. Will putting on a new one on Friday cause bleeding? Hard to know. First choice is to put the old one back on if possible. But if you can't get it on, then don't tape it, don't stick it with anything else, just move on to a new one. So that is her situation. Now I'd like to tell you about Shira. Shira has decided to put an IUD in place. And so let's talk a little bit about IUDs. IUDs are a 3 centimeter long device that are inserted under ultrasound guidance by a physician in the office. And it's really a long-term birth control solution. It's because it requires an initial investment of several months of bleeding to ultimately get to a situation where it's a stable situation. So there are two kinds of IUDs. There's a copper one, which is not hormonal, and it prevents pregnancy by preventing fertilization and preventing implantation. And it involves can have about 3 really hard months of bleeding after it's inserted. Ultimately, and that bleeding is because it causes irritation in the uterus. And ultimately, after about 3 months, a woman will get to a more stable situation where instead of if she was bleeding 3 days before, now she might be bleeding 8 days with this in place. And her cycles are shorter. She'll get her period a little bit earlier. So it is complicated from a NIDA perspective. On the other hand, it is less likely to lead to the tamim that we see with the Mirena. So the Mirena is an IUD that's coated with progesterone, a low dose of progesterone. It releases progesterone at a constant state, so none of the fluctuations that you would see with something like Cerazette. And when it's placed, the first 6 months can be very, very tough because there's so much staining. But eventually, the woman will get to a more stable situation where there's less bleeding, and some women may not bleed at all. So any woman who decides to embark on an IUD needs to know that the first few months could be challenging and needs to review the laws of tamim before having the IUD placed, and really have a halachic authority that she can work with closely to guide her through this, to navigate this process. So Shira is so excited to have the IUD placed because her friends told her the Mirena is great, you won't bleed. So there are 2 issues with that statement. The first is that that not bleeding isn't necessarily great for everyone. There are some women who not bleeding is great for, and becoming NIDA is very disruptive and very stressful. And there are other women who need that. And so it's a very subjective statement. What's great for one person isn't necessarily great for someone else. The other point to make is that not everyone who has a Mirena stops bleeding. In fact, it really depends on what was taking place before you had the Mirena placed. It depends on whether you are younger or you're reaching menopause. If you were bleeding for 5 days previously before the Mirena, and one of those days was heavy, about 25% of women in that situation will stop bleeding completely. After about 6 months, 25% will bleed less and can consider their bleeding tamim and potentially avoid going to the mikveh, and the rest will continue to bleed. So it's not 100%. A woman who was bleeding heavily before the Mirena, about 5% of them will stop bleeding completely, and 25% will bleed less heavily. So it's a little bit less helpful for those women. So Shira wants to know, when she has the Mirena placed, will she become a NIDA? And so the question that she's asking is a very important halachic question. It is there is a halachic concept of ein ptichat kever lelo dam, that the uterus cannot be opened, that it cannot be dilated, the cervix cannot be dilated without blood. So even if when the cervix is dilated, even if you don't see blood, we suspect that there was blood that passed that would make a woman nida. And so the question is, does insertion of an IUD make a woman nida? And this is a machloket. This is a disagreement. There are some poskim who say yes. There's some poskim who say no. Nishmat says no, and the majority of poskim say that insertion of an IUD does not render a woman nida because the cervix is not dilated enough to be considered ptichat kever and to be suspicious for this. Cervix would need to be dilated 19 millimeters for that to take place, and the instruments are not that wide. And so the timing of when to do this depends on what your posek tells you. If he tells you that that insertion of the Mirena does put you into nida, best to do it when you are already tme'ah, and so that the insertion won't make you tme'ah. You're already tme'ah anyway, so it's fine. Do it then. If your posek tells you that insertion of the Mirena does not make you a nida, then the recommendation is to do it when you're tahora, so that if you have ktamim, if you have spotting, it can be treated as ktamim, and you don't need to go that extra distance to do bdikot, do hefsek to get to the mikvah. And so that's the recommendation. I told her to try to do it when she is tahora. Well, her doctor doesn't want to do it when she's tahora because there's a chance, doctors don't like doing it then because the chance the woman might be pregnant. And also the cervix is softer. Doctors don't like to wait until after she's gone to the mikveh because she could be pregnant. Also, the cervix is harder. It's more difficult to maneuver. They prefer to do it when she's right after she gets her period. So I tell her to try to do it after she's done at least a hefsek tara and bdika for day 1, so that at least she's that far in the game, and any bleeding that she sees for the first 2 days can be attributed to dam makah, bleeding from a wound from the instrumentation when the gynecologist grabs the cervix with a tenaculum. And she actually is fortunate enough to do it on day 7. I also tell her to wear a panty liner in case there's any bleeding, and to omit the bdikot if she has to do it on day 1. She's lucky to do it on day 7 after she's done her bdika on day 7, which is wonderful for her, and she gets to the mikvah. But the next few weeks are very tough. She becomes a nida again because she's having a flow from the Mirena, and she's in nida for 5 weeks. She eventually gets to the mikvah, only to have a flow again a week later. And now she'd like to do a hefsek. What should she do? So I instruct her with some of the things we talked about last week, that she can clean herself out before the hefsek. She can do 10 hefseks if she needs, just knowing that the last one is koveya, the last one establishes her status, that they don't need to be completely clean, just free of red, black, or suspicious colors of brown. She gets a hefsek. She says, there's no way I'm going to get a clean bdika on day 1. Can I wash myself out? And so, so in her circumstances, because this is so challenging, yes, she can. But for day 7, I instruct her to cut back on the bdikot. If she can do a middle one, great. If not, this is a time to just do day 7 and to try to get without cleaning herself out. She does, and she is now tahora. And she keeps going with it. I tell her if it's really hard, it may come a point where we have to think about taking it out, but she keeps going with it, and the bleeding is less. And now she is in a situation where some months she has a flow, some months she becomes nida, some months she has ktamim, and she does not become a nida. And this month she had what she thought was a flow and put in a tampon, but it turned out to not be a flow. Is she a nida? So it didn't pan out in the end, and it didn't turn into a flow. It stayed katamim. And so technically she is not a nida. However, she put the tampon in. And what did the tampon show? The tampon showed a red spot. And so even though it turned out that she did not have a flow, the red spot on the tampon made her a nida because, again, as we said, any object, when there's blood on an object that's inside the vagina, we have to worry that there was a hargasha, and any amount of blood in a suspicious color renders her a nida if the object was internal. And so a lesson to her moving forward, not to put the tampon in unless she's absolutely certain that she is a nida. And so the months go on, and somehow she gets to the point where really she doesn't have a flow every month. She just has ktamim. And the ktamim come the same time every month. She wants to know the fact that they come the same time every month, am I a nida? And so I ask her, do you have hargasha with the blood? No. Do you have flow with the blood? No. Are you seeing the blood immediately after urinating or after relations? Did you put a tampon in? No, I didn't put a tampon in. Technically, you're not a nida. And so when you have that bleeding, be careful. Be sure to have a panty liner. Be sure to wear colored underwear. Now, Tova has an IUD, but she has a copper IUD in place. And it is not simple having this copper IUD in place. She has 5 days of staining, followed by a period, which lasts about 9 days. She gets to the mikvah, I can't even do the math, around day 20. And then her periods start around day 30. Happens to be that this month, her haflaga is day 26. She's already spotting. And her husband's coming home on miluim. She wants to know, does she have to do a bdika for her haflaga? Because she knows if she does a bdika, she is going to be a nida. And so we talk about bdikot for onat prisha. And I explained to her that for a vesek kavua, for a fixed period, or the 30th day for a non-fixed period, she cannot have relations on the ona, and she cannot resume relations until she has done a bdika. However, for the chodesh, if she has a non-fixed period for the chodesh and for the haflaga, for the interval, she must separate during those periods. And if she forgets to do a bdika, she is still permitted to her husband as long as she doesn't have hargasha with staining, or she hasn't seen the blood immediately after genital stimulation, after urinating, and as long as the blood, the stains, is not a stain that would prohibit her. More than 19 millimeters on something white that receives ritual purity, everything we've been over. And so in her situation, she can omit the bdika until Ona Benonit, until the 30th day, at which point she must do the bdika. So these are just some examples of some of the medical and halachic issues that arise during around different forms of birth control and some of the different issues to consider. And over the last 2 weeks, we've had some very dry conversations. We've talked about what makes you a nida and what makes you nida and steps to take to help you get to tahara. And you could argue that this is not very spiritually uplifting. I would say that anything that makes that helps us understand Taharat Mishpacha better and makes Nida more livable and more understandable and more accessible, has to enhance our performance of the mitzvah. But I'd like to take the last few moments that we have together to talk about ways to make the actual mikveh experience more spiritually meaningful. And so what can we do when we're in the mikveh, when we're preparing for the mikveh, to really enhance, to speak to our neshama, to keep the waters fresh for us, not just outside the mikveh, but inside the mikveh, to inspire us spiritually. And so Eden has taken 7 steps to prepare for the mikveh from Mayim HaChaim and translated it into Hebrew and adapted it to really maximize the spirituality of the mikveh experience. And so just as Hashem created the world in 7 days, we have offered 7 steps to of rebirth in the process of or of rediscovery in the process of preparing for the mikveh. And so step number 1 is hineni, to prepare ourselves spiritually for the mikveh experience. Entering and exiting the mikveh marks a spiritual moment in our lives. And this process, it marks the process from going from tuma to tahara. And so take a few moments of quiet, take a deep breath, and think about this change that will transpire when you immerse in the mikveh. Step number 2, hidur mitzvah, really making the mitzvah extra special. Our bodies are beautiful, and our bodies have their own inner beauty. And so when we go to the mikveh, there's no need for decorations or external accoutrements. We remove all of the physical barriers between our body and the water. We take off our jewelry. We take off our makeup. Step number 3, nekavim. God created us as a beautiful model, a perfect model, a complete model, and we should really rejoice in the beauty that everything that He created works. Even when we go to the bathroom, that works. Step number 4, B'Tselem Elokim. God created us in His image. And so when we enter the mikveh, we go in naked, the same way we came into this world, without distinction, without special privilege. We all have the same status. Take off our clothing. We remove our glasses, our contacts, bandages, our hearing aids, dental work that we can take out the Nuva to come back to what we began with, the way we were born. Step number 5, Elokai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi, that to prepare our bodies, to take a moment to enjoy our bodies, to appreciate the beauty and wonder and miracle of our bodies. Wash our bodies carefully from the tips of our toes to our heads. Wash our hair, clean ourselves, each part of our body, the folds in our bodies, and to comb our hair. Step number 6, kol haneshama tahalel ka, that to really luxuriate in our 5 senses. Clean our ears, clean our nose, clean the dirt from our eyes, brush our teeth, look in the mirror, and appreciate our 5 senses. And think about our ability to look at life, to look at the world, to use our sense of sight, to look at the world positively and create a world through speech and through concentration. And number 6, tikkun olam. Use our strengths to build a world of life, and to think about our strength in our legs and our hands as we check our fingers and our toes to build a better world. And so now when we're ready to immerse in the mikveh, both physically and spiritually, to take a moment to pause, not to rush, to let the water wash over us, embrace us, cover us, and to let the water take us to the next step, to the next moment, and everywhere that we're meant to go. And so the mikveh, when we go to the mikveh, our bodies become a vehicle for kedusha. And so these are the 7 steps. And once we have immersed in the water, once we've taken these 7 steps, as we go into the water, to be present, to allow the water to immerse us, to feel the warmth of the water, to relax, open our hands and our heart, feel the water envelop us. It's as though we are being embraced by the Kadosh Baruch Hu. For some women, though, having the balanit present can really be a distraction. And so you might want to turn away as you recite the bracha and focus on something meaningful for you. You can ask the balanit for extra time in the water by yourself afterwards, or use the time to daven for something that is meaningful for you. This is a time when your tefillot will be answered. And if you can have better concentration, whatever it takes to maximize the experience. If you want the balanit to examine you and that enhances your experience, yes. Otherwise, ask her to come in after you're already in the water. And sometimes, just bear in mind, there are times when going to the mikveh is not going to be as spiritually uplifting. Sometimes it's really hard to have that connection. And sometimes it's hard to make that moment spiritually meaningful, and that's okay. And for those times when it isn't, when it's hard to connect, it's just enough to show up. It's just enough to be there. And so I hope our meetings together have given you tools to keep the waters fresh outside the mikveh as well as inside the mikveh. Questions?
I have a question. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I have a question. Thank you very much, by the way. This is super informative. I was told by my college teacher 100 years ago when I first, before I got married, that women have a very special power. And if they declare themselves a nida, then they're a nida, whether what they saw was actually dam nida or not. And when you mentioned the story about, well, did this woman put in a tampon? Well, then if she put in a tampon, then she believes she has a flow, then she believes she's a nida, right? So and I remember a rabbi from when I was in the States said the same thing, well, if you feel that you have a flow that is going to cause you to put in a nida, put in a tampon, then you're declaring yourself a nida. So is that true? And what's the story behind that?
Okay, so that's a really good point and we talked about this last week, that a woman has the power to, you can become nida from all of the things we talked about, or you become a nida just by going and declaring yourself a nida. But in the situation where you're not sure, and you think you might be a nida, and then the reality changes, then that's not the case. Now you're right. If she put the tampon in because she thought she was a nida, that might present a halachically problematic situation. She put it in because she just wasn't thinking clearly. But if you're putting it in because you think you're a nida, that certainly that could potentially affect your status, and that's a very good point. If you think you're, to illustrate that point, if you are not sure if you're a nida and you go along and then you do a hefsek tara, but you're not sure, you're a nida because you did the hefsek tara. Yeah. And one could say that the tampon is in the same category if that was her thought process. That's why it's best, if you're not sure, and you see some blood, you say to your husband, I don't know, I might be a nida. As soon as you say, I'm a nida, and you go and separate the beds, then there's a halacha question to ask if it turns out that you're not a nida.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
No question, just wanted to say thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have one last question. It's just a general question. In terms of like, I guess like, in terms of resources, like for general questions or information, I know that like Nishmat has an amazing website and their hotline is really incredible. Are there any other resources, you know, you would suggest for just like general information? Like if, you know, someone has like not like a non-specific question that, you know, they can just say instead of like flipping through a book, they can go to like this website or this contact.
So first of all, Rav Knoll's book, which I held up to the camera last week. I don't have it. I didn't bring it here,
Yeah.
but Rav
Yeah.
Knoll's book, Ish V'Isha, is a wonderful resource. And I consult it all the time. And I know that a lot of college teachers teach from that book. So that's a really good resource. And yep, Nama's holding up her copy for everyone to see. That's a good resource. In terms of mikvot, if you have a question about where you can find a mikvah in your area, mikvah.net is a good resource. In terms of keeping track of NIDA issues, the mikvah calendar app is a wonderful app. It will find out vestot patterns that you never even could have imagined. So that's also a good resource. And I know that it's a little bit, it's also important to find someone that you can show marot to, because Nishmat can't do that on the phone.
We have that issue here.
And you really, sorry?
We have that issue here.
Yes, yes, yes,
You know,
yes.
when I lived in Ranana, there were so many people we could go to that like we felt comfortable with, and here people are really struggling. That's actually been a really big question. We have in Kiryat Gat, Chana Rasby is training in the Nishmat. She's in the Yoetzet program right now, and a few people, I've sent a few people posted questions that people asked me privately, and she, in 6 months, she's graduating, and then hopefully that will be a really, really good resource to people in the community. Because even like our shul doesn't have a Rav. The Anglos in the community don't know Rabbanim in Kiryat Gat, and if there's no like female that, so I think people are really struggling with that. But maybe when Chana graduates, hopefully.
Yes, if she's trained in marot, I think, I don't know if, I don't believe that that's part of the Yoetzet program. It's something additional.
Oh, interesting. I
So
don't know.
encourage her to take advantage of any training they can offer her in that. I'm happy to take a look when I'm in Kiryat Gat, or I don't know if I can volunteer Naama to be a go-between, but
I've done that before. It's fine. You can volunteer me.
between her coming to me and me going to her, it's please God, we should see each other quite often. So
I live in Evan Shmuel, which is not too far from you guys. I have never really had that many situations where I had to show anyone anything since I moved here, but I know that people have, you know, enough people here that they know who to go to, English speakers. So
Aliza, could you get us that information? Because
I
a
can
lot of
ask
people
her.
have asked me,
I'll-
especially like a Rav that speaks English. I think people were really looking for that, and a Rav that could like listen to a story. I know people were very disturbed when they like dropped it off at like a Haredi rabbi that like takes marot, and then he was like, not good.
Our hashkafa, that's the problem.
right.
Not the hashkafa, exactly, like someone that you could speak to. I think people would really appreciate recommendations, Aliza. Thank you. You could send me. I'll forward on.
Great. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you. That, like, I guess these 2 sessions have kind of been the first thing that I've like done alone since I gave birth 5 months ago. And I was like, I've really been looking forward to it, and thank you, Ima, for allowing that. And I don't know, giving me something to do other than worry about babies all day. Thank
Well,
you.
you can thank your wonderful community for organizing this,
Thank you, Sharon and Tara.
where you are so fortunate to live.
Thank you so much. We should be able to host you soon in person again here in Carmagot.
I look forward to it. And davening in your shul, which must be bursting at the seams if you ever go indoors.
Please God, we should have a shul indoors to burst.
Amen, amen, amen.
Good night, everyone.
All right,
Thank
you
you,
so much.
thank you.